countries within Europe and beyond. Their rise has fractured party systems, undermined liberal democratic norms, and forced mainstream parties to redefine their platforms.
To help us understand this political transition, we are joined by one of Europe's foremost scholars on populism and the radical right. Professor Sarah de Lange has spent her career analyzing the shifting cleavages in Western democracies. Please welcome Sarah de Lange.
Welcome. Please take a seat.
Thank you.
Sarah, it's so lovely to have you on our stage today. Most of our guests, to be honest, aren't very familiar with this setting, but you probably walk through this hall every week.
I do. It's directly on the way to my office.
Yeah, so for those of us here who maybe didn't have you as their introduction to political science tutor, could you give us a quick rundown of what your academic focus is?
Yes, so for the past 20 or so years, I've been studying what I call far-right parties. So that includes both extreme right and radical right parties, undemocratic ones and democratic ones. And I've been particularly interested in how they reshape politics, both in terms of how they change party competition, so how the competition with mainstream parties evolves when these new parties emerge, how they impact on government formation and the policies that are made when these parties assume office, and more broadly, how they impact on liberal democracy. So what the quality of democracy is after these parties have had either direct or indirect impact on our democratic systems.
So you've been working on populism and the radical right since your PhD. Was there a particular inciting incident that led you to focus on this?
So I was a student in the old Dutch system, so that was a system in which you would study for 4 years, no bachelor, master, in the early 2000s. And in 2002, in my third year of study, we had earthquake elections here in the Netherlands, where Pim Fortuyn was participating with a newly founded far-right party, List Pim Fortuyn, and he was assassinated shortly before the elections. And despite the party being leaderless, it won a landslide in the elections, 17%, which in our fragmented Dutch party system is quite a substantial entry into politics. And because of its success, it immediately entered into government. It was the shortest-lived government we've ever had in the Netherlands. It lasted 3 months. And that whole episode was something so alien in a way to the Dutch politics that I knew, because I, of course, had become an adult in a period of depolarization, low levels of conflict between mainstream parties, broad coalitions. So this very new form of adversarial politics that was brought in by the Pim Fortuyn and the LPF. And the instability it created, it was something that fascinated me. But because there had not been no far-right successfully in the Netherlands before that, there was very little scholarship on it. So, I wanted to write my thesis on this. I didn't know how. And I did an exchange year in Paris at Sciences Po, where they were in a very different situation. Because in 2002, the election year in which Pim Fortuyn participated in the Netherlands, Jean-Marie Le Pen, the then leader of the Front National, actually became second in the presidential elections. And they had been dealing with this party for 20 years because it had experienced its electoral breakthrough in the early 1980s. So their professors gave me a tremendous amount of scholarship that I could use and translate to understand what was going on in the Netherlands. And that really sort of fed into what became a career-long interest in the far right. And honestly speaking, when I was doing my PhD on this topic, I never imagined that almost 20 years later, the far right would be so persistent and so large that I would still be studying it today, because the idea in the early 2000s was that the success of these kinds of parties was going to be temporary, right? It was sparked by very specific events. The idea was that 9/11 played a very big role in it, but also that these parties, because amongst many things they were populist, you know, that populism cannot sustain itself and it will burn out eventually.
On that note, I guess apart from the fact that clearly, maybe more than ever, it's still important, in the 20 years that you've been working on populism, on the radical right, what would you say are one or some of the biggest takeaways that we've learned about the phenomenon that we didn't know before?
So if we take sort of this 20-year perspective or even 25-year perspective and go back to the year 2000, I think, so the first thing that we've learned is that there's no countries that are immune to the far right. So in the early 2000s, the idea was that there were certain countries who hadn't dealt properly with their history. Countries like Austria, for example, that hadn't dealt properly with the Second World War, or countries like France that had a very ambivalent relationship with that. Countries like Italy, where directly after Second World War, neo-fascism re-emerged, and that those were the countries that were quite prone to the re-emergence of these parties, but that a country like Germany, with its memory politics, would probably be immune. And the same idea exists about the Netherlands. You know, it had never had strong far-right subcultures in society, so the idea was that it was very unlikely that such a movement would emerge. Now today, and also that, for example, in Spain and Portugal, because of the legacy of the dictatorial regimes there would be no such thing. What we've seen is that in the last 15 years, every one of these countries has developed a successful far-right party. I mean, the only exception we still have in Europe is Ireland. And the claim that's often made about Ireland is that Sinn Féin, in a way, substitutes for the far right. It channels disaffection in a very different way. So I think that is a first big sort of misconception that we had that we know better about now. Secondly, I think that the idea initially was that sort of the support for these parties would plafon at maybe 20% or so. We now know that's also not the case. There's plenty of examples of these parties reaching 30 or even more % of the vote, which, you know, is a third of the population, right? We need to be very clear about that. That size is very unusual in most countries and therefore very noteworthy. And the idea that these parties would actually be regular government partners in many countries was also seen as unthinkable of. I mean, in the 1990s, no one expected these parties to really be taken seriously in government by mainstream parties, right? The first parties that entered government was in Italy. But there the argument was, well, I mean, that's because Berlusconi wants to work with him, and Berlusconi is very particular in itself, right? We can't consider him a regular mainstream politician that takes democracy seriously. So, you know.
When do you think that changed here in the Netherlands?
So in the Netherlands, it's changed very rapidly. And that's also interesting, right? Because you see some countries, so this is all about norm erosion, and it's about the fact that political parties are much more opportunistic than we often like to believe. You know, we like to believe that they're very ideology-driven, but when it comes to government participation, they can be very opportunistic. So we've seen all kinds of cases where mainstream parties have said for a long time, we will not govern with the far right, until an election result was produced that just made it very, very attractive strategically. And the Netherlands is a country where this happened really rapidly, because in the election campaign of 2002, the mainstream politicians of the right, so of the Christian Democrats and the conservative liberals, were still saying that they would not cooperate with the list Pim Fortuyn. And then the election outcome was there and they did it. Because they said, you know, the voter has spoken, which is a very difficult statement in multi-party politics, because, you know, on the basis of election results, there are always all kinds of different coalitions possible.
So I think speaking also of, you know, mainstream parties accepting populist parties as coalition partners, your work focused also on the effects of the rise of populist parties on party systems and party system stability. And one thing that you discussed in one of your articles is that how in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a clear decline in support for the three main parties, the PvdA, the VVD, and the CDA. What was this cause of the decline of the support?
So across Europe, we see a long-term trend of mainstream parties losing support. And Christian Democrats and Social Democrats more so than conservative liberals. And, you know, part of that is simply countries coming out of pillarization, which of course was very strong in the Netherlands. You know, the idea that you would live in your own community based on your social identity comprised of your religion and your social class, etc. But polarization actually existed in one form or another in many countries in Europe.
So it's also the idea that that was fundamentally determining the way that
for
people voted.
your vote, yes. Right. So it was your community, your identity, it articulated your interests and therefore influenced your voting behavior. And there's been, you know, large developments such as secularization, the expansion of the middle class, individualization, that have made that voters are actually doing what we would like them to do, which is make a conscious choice as to what party to support based on their own convictions, their own interests, their own identities, and the parties that are on offer. And that has cost these parties that were really, you know, products of polarization dearly. Not in the last place because, you know, because they knew they could count on an electorate, so they had become very complacent about actually exploring what kinds of social problems their electoral constituencies were experiencing, and also representing their constituency politically. Because over the past decades, most parliaments across Europe have become very, very highly educated, with an overrepresentation also of politicians with a history in the public sector or you know, career politicians, with the result that many, many voters don't recognize themselves in elected representatives and do not believe that they can articulate their social experiences.
Right, so that makes it a little bit tricky, right? Because there's no longer one or several clear factors that determine principally how a person votes.
Yeah.
And that's been a big idea in the political science scholarship for the past couple of decades. So what would you say then now is the characteristic or the trait that sort of structures political conflict in this way and determines voting behavior?
So what determines voting behavior is an almost impossible question to answer, because there's so much that goes into it. and every factor explains like a tiny bit. So as we're talking about explaining voting behavior, I think the first important thing is to mention that we can only explain, like, if we take all different factors together, we can explain like 5% or 7% of the variation in voting behavior of people, right? So it's something that where there's so much going on that as scholars we have limited understanding of it, even though we study it a lot. What has changed is that your background characteristics have become far less influential in determining your voting behavior. So, you know, in the 1950s or 1960s, you could make a fairly accurate prediction if you knew someone's age, gender, social class, religion, where they lived, in what part of the country, etc. That is no longer the case. What is more determining for your voting behavior is just the beliefs that you have. And not only the kinds of positions you have on issues that are important, but especially what your beliefs are about what the biggest social problems and challenges are. So if you are a voter with, you know, on average, a lower level of education, it's quite likely that you have anti-immigration stances. But whether or not you actually vote for a far-right party is by and large determined whether or not you believe that immigration is actually the biggest social problem in society. And if you at the same time have left-wing social stances, and you're convinced that housing and healthcare are more pressing problems, then you will actually vote for the left.
Yeah, super interesting. I think that also shows how like these deciding factors for deciding voting, determining voter behavior have become softer. But I still think that, well, I wonder to an extent, is education a modern form of cleavage then in deciding voting behavior like that?
So of all the background factors that we know, at the moment, your level of education is probably the strongest predictor of your voting behavior, especially in countries where political conflict is about cultural issues. So that is immigration, but that can also be climate change. That's more of a lifestyle issue. That can be about democratization. It can be about LGBTQ rights, etc. Under those conditions, we really see a divide between higher educated and lower educated voters in terms of their voting behavior, with the one group voting for far-right parties and the other for more progressive parties. Is that a cleavage? So if political scientists talk about a cleavage, we mean a very, very, very deep divide in society that extends beyond citizens' political identities, but also determine their social identities. It's very interesting because we see that social identities are becoming to some extent connected to political identities. So if we talk about education, you might see advertisement for higher education dating agencies or higher educated insurance companies. And there's been some research in Switzerland that says that people self-identify more as higher educated or lower educated than before. So that it's become more integrated in the way that we think about ourselves in terms of who we are and what our position is in society, and that is increasing and that social class is decreasing in that respect, which is also understandable because there's such a broad middle class that you know encompasses very large swaths of the population. I mean, does that then make for a cleavage? it's very difficult, especially in Europe, where we see that, with multi-party politics, voters change allegiances a lot of the time. I think you see it more in the US, where this education cleavage is also to some extent mapping on the difference in the support between the Democrats and the Republicans, and where it's very clear that citizens' political identities have become very, very important in their daily lives and in their daily behaviors that are not political. So whether it's vaccine uptake or other kinds of behaviors in society, all of these have become highly correlated in the US to your political preference. And that is something that we see a little bit in Europe, but not to the same extent as in the US.
Right. So coming back to specifically the issue of, or the topic of cultural issues that you mentioned, we, over the past couple of years in the Netherlands, have seen the continued popularity of the PVV, which seems to have forced other mainstream right-wing parties to really shift their positions on cultural issues. So we're curious as to how the rise of populist radical right parties shift the policy landscape more broadly.
Yeah. So this is one of the topics that a lot of research has been done on. And the research finds that because mainstream parties lose voters to the far right, they try to regain them by, copying the far right in three ways: by paying more attention to the issues that the far right campaigns on, by moving their positions in the direction of those of the far right, and perhaps most importantly, by sort of adopting the framing, so the way that the problem is presented of the far right. So that is, in this case, talking about all kinds of social issues in cultural terms. And we saw that very clearly in the last elections in the Netherlands, where all of a sudden housing was a cultural issue, because not only the far right, but also mainstream parties said that the shortage in housing was caused by either asylum seekers being entitled to social housing, or by expats buying up housing on the market, etc. So everyone had an argument that was immigration related. The interesting thing, I think, is that most of the research shows that this takes place, this copying. It takes place in a lot of policy domains, so not only immigration, but also in terms of, the parties devoting more attention to European integration, becoming more Eurosceptic. We see it when it comes to what's called welfare chauvinism, so supporting a welfare state, but being very restrictive who can, who is entitled to its support, not only in terms of immigration, but also to what the far right sees as social parasites, for example. But at the same time, the research also shows that often this change in position taking already started prior to the far right becoming successful. So the Netherlands is a very clear case of that. So the LPF didn't emerge till 2002. In the 1990s, the leader of the conservative liberals, Bolkestein, who passed away last year, he already put the whole notion of cultural compatibility of migrants on the political agenda in the Netherlands.
On this note, you were interviewed for a New York Times article back in 2017.
Okay.
After the formation of the third Rutte cabinet.
Yeah.
And the title of this article was "To Hold Off the New Right, the Dutch Coalition Party Embraces It."
Yeah.
Now, 8 years later, reflecting on this article, was the embrace of the right the way to go?
So, I mean, this is not only based on this particular case, right? Because there's been many instances in the past 20 years where mainstream parties have decided to either govern with the far right or to deliberately exclude them from power, while at the same time taking up their issues, so showing this copying behavior. The vast majority of that research shows that the copying while excluding at the same time is not very effective.
Effective in what sense?
In the sense that it doesn't lead voters to return to mainstream parties. And that makes sense because in addition to your position taking and your framing of political issues, there's also something that's called issue ownership. So voters see some parties as more competent, more credible on a particular issue than another. And they see far-right parties as being particularly credible on immigration issues. So when mainstream parties copy their stances, they often feel, well, why vote for the copy if I can also vote for the original, which is the far-right party? And so, and this is also how the far right keeps growing, right? Mainstream parties take up their issues. These issues become very central to election campaigns. Also, of course, helped by international developments, because, 2017, we were just on the last legs of the so-called refugee crisis. There have been other developments as well, of course, that also play into the salience of immigration as a theme. But, as long as elections are about immigration, the chances that the far right profits from that are very substantial.
And I mean, one place where the far right recently came into government is actually also the Netherlands. But we can't really talk about that without talking about what happened a couple of weeks ago, the recent fall of the government.
This was not, when we scheduled this talk, we had no idea the government would collapse.
A complete coincidence. But so we saw them withdraw support from the coalition after presenting 10 points for tougher migration. However, other coalition partners also said that they might support at least some of these points.
Yeah.
Was this an actual concern for migration policy, or do you think Wilders thought it would benefit him electorally?
So I think to understand this move, you need to understand what happened in 2010, which is, most of you were fairly young for that, not everyone. But so in 2010, the PVV decided to support a right-wing government, also of the Christian Democrats and the Conservative Liberals, the second Rutte cabinet. And it decided to support it because it was not allowed in. Right? So the argument was that especially its anti-Islam stances were unconstitutional and therefore it could not enter the government coalition. And it supported the government coalition for 2 years. But then there had to be negotiations about the annual budget. And to make the budget sound, one thing that had to be discussed was changes to the pension system in the Netherlands. And Geert Wilders at that time had, on average, older voters. It's no longer the case, but at that time there was an overrepresentation of older voters. So he was not particularly keen on tighter pension laws. So it was a very similar situation as now. He feared electoral ramifications. There had to be negotiations about new proposals. And he negotiated for a little bit until he said, this compromise really goes too far. I can't make it. And that's how he toppled the government. And what he did here was more or less the same. He showed willingness to negotiate about migration policy. He presented his plans, but he also was in a situation where he was under a lot of electoral pressure because he had been losing support in the last months. And he came to a very crucial point shortly before the negotiations, which is that he had become tied in terms of support in the polls with the conservative liberals and the social democrats. And that's a big change in position if you've been the largest party for a year. And sort of a really warning sign if you don't act now, you might go into the election campaign actually being ranked second or third. And so I think he deliberately entered these negotiations to show willingness to compromise, but also knowing that at the end he would conclude that the compromise could not be reached, so that he could make sure that the government fell, he could withdraw from it, and the stage had been set for the election campaign to be about immigration, which is a precondition for a good election result for him.
I think one thing that we saw after the last time he withdrew support from the coalition was that Rutte always framed him as a wegloper, or someone who walks away and is unwilling to take responsibility. I think you already see signs that Dylan Jezilgus and other coalition partners might try to do that again. How effective is that going to be at preventing another PVV win?
So this is quite interesting, because there's sort of a common notion that the breaker pays. So you often see that parties that withdraw from a coalition perform poorly in the next elections. And this was the case for the PVV in 2012, because when they withdrew from the coalition or the minority government, they had their worst electoral performance since they were founded in 2006. Interestingly, what we're currently witnessing in the polls is that the support for the PVV is quite stable. Part of that might have to do with the fact that the conservative liberals, the VVD, actually initially didn't know which stance to take, because they spent half a week actually not blaming Wilders, or half blaming him, but not connecting any consequences to that in terms of not wanting to govern with him anymore. But I think part of it is also that Wilders has been quite successful in getting his narrative that, other parties were not willing to compromise into the media. And there's been some surveys done directly after the government collapsed, where you see that his supporters are divided about the fact that he toppled the government. So there's about 2/3 that are very happy about that say that he was in the right, and 1/3 that say he should have taken more responsibility. But if you then ask them, would they vote for him again, then even that 1/3 that said, well, it was maybe not the right decision, still believe that he is the right person to, give them as voters stricter immigration policies. So, Rutte's strategy was quite successful, because he was very, very consistent in stating that he would not work with him because he was unreliable, but also because that was supported directly after that by Wilders being convicted in the fewer Moroccans case. So it was, I will not work with him because he's unreliable and he's a convicted politician that has crossed the constitutional line. So that the doubling of these two arguments was particularly strong, whereas now Jezilgus is, first of all, not very consistent, and secondly, also, the extent to which her party co-opts PVV positions now also undermines the statements about excluding him, I think. So I think it's two different situations, with as a result that the current one might not affect the PVV too much electorally in the elections.
Thank you. I think now we have some time to move on to a couple audience questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and someone will come by with a mic. Yeah, to the, in the corner there.
So you spoke at the start about how what we've learned about the populist radical right is that it's not just a fluke, that it's something that is here to stay. And then the next 20 years we've been dealing with that. What do you think is an ideal course of action for mainstream parties to deal with the populist radical right, since it doesn't look like they're going anywhere?
Yeah. So, electorally speaking, the most probable calls of action, because we don't see very much, so we don't know if the effects are as good as political scientists expect, but it is for mainstream parties to go back to their ideological roots and to emphasize the issues that they find important. The problem with that advice is that mainstream parties are, of course, also very dependent on the media. There was a fascinating headline last weekend, because it was the party conference of the VVD. And they had deliberately made everything about security and socioeconomic growth and not about migration. And the headline in one of the newspapers was, VVD Congress, not about immigration. So, I mean, as long as this is the dynamic, it's very difficult for mainstream parties to change the political agenda, right? So, you know, they don't have full... But I think it's an important starting point, that people need to go back to their ideological roots, think about modern-day society problems from that ideological perspective, because, you know, from a social democratic perspective, you'll come with very different takes on the threat of AI to society or other big developments that are taking place, and then proceed. But there's something else, and we've been very Europe-focused here, and therefore we haven't talked a lot about liberal democracy and democratic backsliding. But I mean, more than anything, the concerns of mainstream parties should not be electoral. They should be about the system itself. Because the democratic erosion that we're seeing, even in established democracies, and that's not just the US, because that is a very exceptional case, but there's clear democratic backsliding in some dimensions taking place, for example, in Italy under Meloni. She wants to transform the parliamentary system into a presidential system, which is far more vulnerable. She is trying to curtail the judiciary, etc. So that should be the first concern of mainstream parties, you know, actually assuring that we continue to live in liberal democracies across the globe.
I think we have time for one more audience question and then move on. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, hi. I have a question relating to the future of democratic pluralism.
Mm-hmm.
So nowadays, especially on our feeds, I imagine we see a lot of polarized content, right? You kind of get stuck in your own algorithmic echo chamber. How do you see that? Because it's only going to get worse. So do you see some kind of policy intervention coming in the future that might fix that?
Well, I mean, the fix is straightforward, which is that we should make sure that we have enough state control of social media companies, right? Because we know where the problems are in the commercial models of these platforms and how they contribute to societal development. And that is also, I find that a very interesting question, because, you know, we have the necessary legal framework to do this in the European Union with the Digital Services Act, but it's not really being used. Also because there's a lot of fear about how large platforms will respond. But there's the interesting case of Brazil. Brazil, of course, like the US, had to deal with a coup after the presidential elections because Bolsonaro wanted to stay in power. And Brazil has shown how resilient it is as a liberal democracy. Not only has it prosecuted Bolsonaro and all his accomplices in a very effective way, it has also used the legislation that they've created for big platforms to really force them to adhere to the rules they set. And especially Musk said, you know, I'm not going to obey and this and that. And they just stood strong and they won. So it can, if Brazil can do it, definitely the EU can do it. But there's a lack of political courage, I think, on these kinds of issues.
Okay, so coming back to the interview, you wanted to talk more about liberal democracy. So one thing that we have definitely witnessed a lot is fear of this tension, right, that exists between populism and liberal democracy, and then also with populist radical right parties. What we see is that they heavily campaign on issues that seem to attack liberal norms, thinking of the protection of minority rights, for example. But then once they come into power, we often see a more open attack on democratic processes and institutions. So we were wondering, is it just liberal democracy that's under threat, or also our electoral institutions?
So that really depends on the situation in the political system. So what we see very often is that it's death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? So if you take sort of Hungary as the classic case, you see a government that over the course of several election cycles takes small steps every time to make life for all the countervailing powers in society, so that's not only opposition parties or the media and judiciary, also civil society, make it more difficult to challenge the government. What we've seen in the US is something completely different, which is the full-blown attack on the system itself in a matter of weeks. To the extent that the US is, you know, according to most political scientists, no longer a liberal democracy, it's an authoritarian regime. You know, we can only guess whether there will be free elections in a couple of times, but in the meantime, it's not a functioning democracy. So that, you know, those are two very different extremes. And I think we do need to keep them apart analytically. Because what we're seeing in Hungary is that it's actually possible, in this case of very, very slow democratic backsliding, that there is a turn in society. And if you look at the polls now, the challenger of Viktor Orban, who's left his party and founded his own party, actually is higher in the polls than he is. So, you know, it might be that there will be political change there simply by holding elections. And we've seen that this was also possible in Poland. So for that reason, I think it's very important to still say a lot of these parties attack the liberal pillar of liberal democracy, but the electoral process itself remains somewhat intact, and intact enough for the opposition to be able to change the situation for the better, and situations where that is no longer the case. And a classic example of that is, of course, Venezuela. They're still holding elections. That's not the problem. It's the problem that the outcome is not honored.
I think that's also, well, Venezuela might be the case of left-wing populism.
Yes.
Eroding democracy. In general, we see that there are more concerns about the populist radical right and its relationship towards democracy than the populist radical left. So to what extent is it populism that's actually a danger to democracy, or is it the ideology of these populist parties, like authoritarianism and nativism.
Yeah. So I think that is very important to note, because, I mean, if you look in the media, a lot of it will be about populism. But in reality, the main threats stem from the authoritarianism and the nativism that are actually at the core of the thinking of these parties. And I think you see that most clearly at the moment in the US, for example, where there's a lot of things you can say about Donald Trump, but not that there's anything populist about what he's doing. It's very authoritarian. It's also very nativist, to the point where you might say it's even white supremacist. But there's very little, he's not glorifying ordinary citizens and giving them more power in politics through referenda or other kinds of tools that, show the volonté générale in political decision making at all.
So I think it's also fair to hope that when populists are in power, and in these cases very exorbitantly anti-democratic, obviously citizens vote against them. But as you mentioned, we saw with Trump, even with the recent Polish elections, it seems that maybe citizens don't hold or find democratic ideals to be as important, especially at the ballot box. So to you, how do you think we recenter this sort of importance of democratic resilience to the average voter?
Yeah, so I think, there's different answers to this, right? So one part of the answer is that in many countries, citizens are rightfully dissatisfied with democracy to the extent that it's not delivering what they're hoping for. In the sense, we're going to get very close to an actual political science lecture, but, there's a lot of displacement of decision-making in the sense that national parliaments have less control over important decisions than in the past. There's more power with supranational institutions, there's more power with technocratic agencies, there's more power with commercial organizations, etc. So there's less scope for national governments in most contexts to actually change policy to such an extent that they can make a proper difference in citizens' life. So that's one. At the same time, politicians often use this as an excuse for not doing anything, right? Say it's beyond our control, especially it's the EU, right? We can't do anything when that's not always true. I think another thing is that democracy has disappeared from civil society to a large extent. So in terms of workplace democracy, school democracy, look at elections here at the University of Amsterdam, turnout is atrocious. Democracy is something that is practiced on a daily basis for democratic norms to really live in citizens. And that's not the case if you only get to go and vote every couple of years. So, we need to put a lot of effort into re-democratizing our societies so that political self-confidence of citizens is high enough that they feel that they can participate, but also that they value democracy enough to stand up for it when it's necessary. And of course, in addition to that, we need good civic education, etc. But that's sort of a no-brainer. I think that living democratically on a daily basis is equally important.
So one thing, apart from all of the research that you do, that we felt we could not not talk about was you are obviously an academic. You work on scientific research, and that is often also a target of populist attacks. And you experienced this yourself back in 2021, where you were doxxed by Europe Links. And it clearly wasn't an isolated incident. Many academics that focus on the populist radical rights have undergone this kind of threat, And so we were curious about whether, in your experience, what the consequences were, not just for you, but also for the academic community more broadly.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very important theme, I think. There's a recent report out from the Royal Scientific Society in the Netherlands, also about the threats that exist to academic freedom. If we look at the US, we see clear attacks on universities by the Trump regime. And this all has to do with the fact that countervailing powers, as I said, are being attacked by these parties. And universities are part of these countervailing powers because they question the status quo through research. So it's a very widespread phenomenon that's clearly intensifying in terms of threats to scholars. There's also in the Netherlands scholars that actually need surveillance, for example. These kinds of things do happen. The implications for science, I think, are substantial, in the sense that even if the scholar who is directly affected decides not to withdraw from the public debate, for example, as was in my case one of the things that I had to consider, the impact on the scholars around them is very substantial, and especially on young researchers, such as PhD students. And they become very concerned about engaging with a broader audience. Or they become even concerned to take up certain research topics because they are so vulnerable. And I think in the long run, that might lead to scholars in general, retracting from the public space. I mean, it was a clear case on X where the climate for scholars at some point was so difficult that the scholarly community was the first to move to Blue Sky when it became available as an option, because it was simply not possible to communicate there anymore from our scholars.
And one thing, obviously, that we see that we have to mention is that it seems like particular segments are targeted, specifically looking at women and minorities.
Women, minorities, both ethnic and sexual, yeah.
So is this a coincidence?
Of
or
course
is it a
not.
strategy?
No, I mean, this has to do with the ideology of the far right, right? So they have very clear ideas about gender, they have very clear ideas about minorities, both ethnic and sexual, so it makes perfect sense that those are targeted the most.
I think one thing you already briefly mentioned is that we are currently witnessing the federal government in the US putting its full power in attacking academic institutions like Harvard or Columbia for not adhering to its wishes. Is this hostility to academia inherent to the populist projects?
So, yes and no. So, populism per se glorifies common sense in the way of direct experiences of citizens. So that will be the argument of, there's climate change, yeah, but it snowed this winter for 3 days, right? So this is more like observational experiences that are not collected through scientific standards. So that's one element. The second is that it's anti-elite. And what's more elitist than a university, right? It's by definition that it's included in conceptions of what elites are. So it goes for populist movements per se, but it goes much more for the far right because of the authoritarianism and the nativism, which both also have issues with universities. I mean, authoritarianism adheres to the status quo, right? Keep things as they are, especially in terms of lifestyles, etc. And universities, by definition, through research, question the status quo or push them forward. And universities have always been cosmopolitan in the sense that they've been international. And therefore, the nativism also conflicts with universities. So, you know, in the far right, these three oppositions to universities come together and make universities one of the prime targets of policymaking.
So we've spoken about the cost of being threatened, and in the US, we've seen very stark differences as well in the way that institutions have reacted to these threats. But what about the costs of staying silent? We were reminded of what Churchill once said, because at the end of the day, appeasement is like feeding a crocodile and hoping to be the last one eaten.
And you mean appeasement in what way? Appeasement in the way that institutions like Harvard are trying to sort of manage the threat by consenting to some
Columbia capitulating.
Yeah. I mean, so this is more to do with authoritarianism, and there's a lot of research on how authoritarian regimes operate. And one thing is that they test how far they can go. So it's a very well-known phenomenon that they will ask you to do something, and when you comply, they'll ask you to do more. This is also what these institutions were warned for by authoritarianism scholars. So in that sense, appeasement doesn't work. But of course, the costs of standing up individually are very high. And I think this is also a bit the problem for universities in the US, right? These are very privatized individual institutions, which is very different from the Dutch situation, where all the universities are very strongly connected in the Association of Dutch Universities, and they've been working together in that for a long time. So the costs of coordinating resistance in the US are far higher than those, for example, in the Dutch system.
I think after everything that's happened in the US over the past 5 months, a general panic has kind of set in across a lot of observers. And we hear comparisons to the 1930s in prominent newspapers, and also I think some of that anxiety is also carried over to Europe. Last week on Even Jinek, Frans Timmermans said that the next elections would decide the future of Dutch democracy. Is this panic justified?
So the panic is justified, I think, in the US context, because of the speed of the authoritarianism being displayed. I mean, if we look only at this weekend and what has happened in terms of opposition politicians not only being made impossible to execute their functions, but losing their lives over it, that is something that is beyond anything we could have imagined prior to the elections. It's different in the Netherlands and many other parts of Europe because the fragmented nature of multi-party systems and parliamentarianism means that coalition building will always have a dampening effect on these things. And in the European context, there's more layers of judicial recourse that can be effective than in the US context. So in that sense, I'm more hopeful for Europe, even though we see in, for example, a case like Italy, if there's two far-right parties that govern together, then effectively you also have a far-right majority. And then also, I mean, if Italy gets a presidential system, which is the same that Erdogan did to also sustain his own power, then that will be a very vulnerable country.
So as we wrap up this hour, we wanted to come back to an interview that you did with the Volkskrant a couple of years ago. where you said that liberal democracy deserves a defense.
Yeah.
It's the best system we have.
It's fundamentally flawed, very vulnerable, but it is the best system we have.
Well, what keeps you hopeful in this idea that liberal democracy deserves our strongest defense?
I think what keeps me hopeful is that in many countries there is young people willing to engage with the system, whether it's through conventional political participation or protest to pressure politicians. And that keeps me hopeful that we will be able to maintain the system long term. I know that there's been a lot of sort of alarmist coverage at times about youngsters not supporting liberal democracy. But if we look a bit more detailed at the data, the situation is actually not that dire. And I have a lot of faith in the youngest generations that are growing up now, becoming politically mature, that they will be part of the solution in terms of sustaining liberal democracy.
On that note,
And especially, I see that in my lectures, right? My own students are what give me most hope.
on that note, thank you.